Church history, like all history, has winners and losers, heroes and villains. And church history, again, like all history, is written mainly by the winners and from their perspective. What they wrote may have been deliberately biased and hostile, or they may have attempted to be sympathetic and fair. But the history that emerges is necessarily an interpretation of events, personalities, beliefs and practices. Although there may be other legitimate interpretations or flaws in the official interpretation, it is not always easy to discover these. In this unit, we will examine the ways in which the history of the Anabaptist movement has been told and retold. Cowboy films have enjoyed popularity over many decades. The scenery, the colourful characters, the action and adventure combine to produce a form of entertainment that appeals to a wide audience. With very few exceptions, these films portray the cowboys as heroes and the Indians as villains. The cowboys as relatively civilized and the Indians as barbaric. The cowboys as winners and the Indians as losers. Many films are based on historical events, though most embellish these to improve the entertainment value, and historically, of course, the cowboys were ultimately successful in subduing the Indians and asserting their culture across North America. But what did these events look like from the perspective of the Indians? Well-researched historical accounts are available of the conquest of North America, written from the perspective of Native Americans. Some of the same characters appear and the places are the same, though called by different names, but the story of invasion, usurpation of territory, broken agreements, torture and massacre, abuses of human rights and cultural imperialism is quite different. But filmmakers have not rushed to produce films that reflect this interpretation of history. Why not? Who judges what interpretations of history appear in history books, in films, and on news programs? How often do you stop to ask what historical or contemporary events might look like from another perspective? In all human activities, our natural inclination is to want to side with the winners and to distance ourselves from the losers. In spite of the fact that Jesus turned everything upside down, or right way up, depending on one's perspective, and spoke about the first being last and the last first, and about those who lose their own lives for my sake finding them, most Christians do not get too excited about the thought of being losers.
When we look at church history, it is tempting to spend all our time on the winners, the mainline churches, establishment Christianity. We may not like everything we find here, but at least we are on safe ground, and there are some wonderful saints to be found. The fringe groups that appear in the margins of many textbooks, or are dismissed as schismatics or heretics, sound interesting but dangerous. Are they worth studying, or do we accept the judgment of their contemporaries and later generations of historians? Even if we are interested enough to explore one or more of these groups, it is difficult to discover much about them from these meagre references in the familiar historical textbooks. This may not simply be because the writers of these books were uninterested in such groups. Often there is limited information about them available to historians. Those whose views and policies prevailed in each generation made sure that their version of events became the official version. The writings of the losers were destroyed, their activities interpreted in the worst possible light, and their memory vilified. What we know of many fringe groups is drawn largely from their opponents, and this is usually open to the charge of being somewhat biased. However, although many of these difficulties remain, the situation is less bleak than it used to be. During the past 80 years or more, several of these groups have found champions prepared to set aside the traditional evaluations of their significance and present them in a new light, using what little remains of their own writings and refusing to accept uncritically the accounts given by their enemies. It is now possible to put together what might be termed a loser's guide to church history, a survey of an alternative radical church history that is quite different from the official version. Into this survey, Anabaptism would fit. This module draws gratefully on the research and scholarship of several historians who have provided translations of primary sources, revisited earlier accounts, and offered new interpretations of the available data. But for many movements, there are still difficulties. The few written sources available to us do not give us a complete picture, and it is tempting to fill in the gaps from our imagination or using doubtful sources. A good example of this is the popular book by E.H. Broadbent, The Pilgrim Church, which attempts to trace a silver thread of Christianity from the 1st century to the 20th. It is a wonderful and inspiring account, which has introduced many to otherwise marginalised groups, and it contains much historical data. But it assumes too much, makes unwarranted connections, and is sometimes unreliable. We simply have to accept that our knowledge of some groups or individuals is very limited, and with most it probably always will be. There is little prospect of new source material being discovered. Many of these groups in any case were poor and illiterate. They spread their teachings mainly by word of mouth rather than through books. Students of Anabaptism are in a better position than students of most earlier movements, since the advent of printing and the political disintegration of Europe in the 16th century made the effective suppression of Anabaptist literature impossible. More remains than for any earlier radical movement. Another temptation is to create new heroes. In trying to rescue the losers from obscurity and calumny, we can easily gloss over their weaknesses and present an unrealistic and unbalanced picture of them. Around the fringes of the mainline church were real heretics, persistent troublemakers and stubborn individualists. But there were also some wonderful men and women who paid dearly for their faithfulness and courage. All historical study requires interpretation rather than simply fact-gathering, and the present module both includes such interpretation and reflects on the interpretation of others.